So if you were here on Sunday, we're talking about Habakkuk, and we only got through the first about 4 verses. So we're going to try to get through the rest of it tonight. So if you'll turn to Habakkuk chapter 1, we'll start there. And because we only got through about 4 verses, we don't have a lot of time for review tonight. So we're going to try to just get right into the text, and hopefully we'll pick it up well and get a good understanding of what Habakkuk talks about through going through the text. Can I get someone to read Habakkuk chapter 1? We'll go back over quickly through verses 1 through 4. Can someone read 1 through 4 nice and loud for me? Go ahead.
The pronouncement which Habakkuk the prophet saw, "How long, Lord, have I called for help, and you do not hear? I cry out to you violence, yet you do not save. Why do you make me see disaster and make me look at destruction? Yes, devastation and violence are before me. Strife exists and contention arises. Therefore the law is ignored and justice is never upheld. For the wicked surround the righteous. Therefore justice comes out confused."
Okay, so if we remember kind of the basic structure of Habakkuk, like we mentioned on Sunday, there's 2 dilemmas, 2 complaints that Habakkuk has that he's kind of bringing from himself or from the people to God, and then for both of those dilemmas, God has a response. So this is the first complaint or dilemma that Habakkuk has, and how would you summarize what his complaint, what his problem is?
God, why are you letting get away with all this?
Right, so why are you letting this injustice continue? And can someone read the next couple verses 5 through 11?
Right here.
Go ahead.
Look among the nations, observe, be astonished, wonder, because I am doing something in your days you would not believe if you were told. For behold, I am raising up the Chaldeans, that force and impetuous people who march through the earth to seize dwelling places which are not theirs. They are dreaded and feared. Their justice and authority originate with themselves. Their horses are swifter than leopards and keener than wolves in the evening. Their horsemen come galloping. Their horsemen come from afar. They fly like an eagle, swooping down to devour. All of them come for violence. Their horde of faces moves forward. They collect captives like sand. They mock at kings, and rulers are a laughing matter to them. They laugh at every fortress and heap up rubble to capture it. Then they will sweep through like the wind and pass on. But they will be held guilty, they whose strength is their God.
Okay, so how would you summarize that? What is God's response to this dilemma that Habakkuk has? Yep.
He's going to use the Chaldeans as an instrument to...
Right, so God is going to use the Chaldeans, otherwise known as the Babylonians, to judge Judah. Okay, so we'll kind of look at this first dilemma and the response for a little bit. Just wanted to have that up there so we can kind of see what the problem and solution is, and we'll talk through it. So what is the question specifically that Habakkuk was asking in Habakkuk 1 verse 2?
Why aren't you listening to it?
I'm sorry?
Why aren't you listening?
Yeah, why aren't you listening? So how long before you'll answer? How long am I going to cry to you for help before you'll respond? Which, again, like we said on Sunday, it kind of implies that he's been asking God for a while for this. Why is all this injustice going on and you're not doing anything about it? Which were the main kind of 2 questions that Habakkuk asks. Why and when? Why aren't you doing anything about this injustice? When are you going to do something about this injustice? And his main focus of what's going on is this violence, which isn't just the violence that we're about to talk a little bit more about with the Babylonians, the Chaldeans, coming in to exercise God's judgment on Judah, but it's really the violence that's going on among the people of Judah. It's his own people that are fighting amongst themselves, and the law is ignored and justice isn't upheld. So why won't God interfere? And then, like we said, God's answer is, I'm going to do something. I'm going to send the Babylonians. I'm going to send the Chaldeans. So looking at verse 5, God says, look among the nations and see. We'll just stop there for a second. That first line. This is one of the most practical lessons that we can get from Habakkuk. God's use of the nations. That God may tolerate wickedness up to a certain point, but he is going to judge. Judgment is inevitable. God judges the wicked. He can't just idly look at it, which was kind of Habakkuk's problem. Why are you just looking at this wickedness going on and not doing anything about it? And God's answer is, I'm going to do something about it. And that's always God's answer. He will not tolerate wickedness. And as we're about to see, he's going to use a nation that is wicked themselves to judge another wicked nation, which is a whole nother problem that we'll get to in just a moment, because that's kind of the second dilemma. But the second line, wonder and be astounded. For I am doing a work in your days that you would not believe if told. God says, you're not going to believe what I'm going to tell you, but this is what I'm about to do. And Habakkuk may think, well, sure, of course I'm going to believe you, God. Of course I'm going to understand. You're God. Whatever you say is right and fair and just. I think we would think the same thing, that maybe there's things that God does that we wouldn't understand. And we probably think, no, I'll understand, because he's God. He's fair, he's just, he always does the right thing. But do we ever have a hard time believing what God tells us he's going to do? When he tells us he's going to do something, do we ever have a hard time believing that he will do that? Are there ever hard things that God says he'll do? Are there things that God has said that don't really make sense to us, that we struggle to understand or comprehend? Does anyone think of any examples of that kind of thing? I mean, this would be one of them, but something along the same lines. Yeah.
That he sent his only son to die for us,
Yeah.
sinners, and we continue to sin.
I mean, that didn't make sense to the apostles. When Jesus would tell them that he was going to die, they didn't believe him.
Example that always comes to my mind is after God had promised Abraham a son, and I'll make a great nation out of that son, and now I want you to go kill him.
Yeah. And so kind of what Habakkuk is going through is a battle of faith, like we all go through. When God tells us hard things in his word, and like he has told a lot of people in the scriptures, as we're seeing, God sometimes says things that are hard for us to comprehend, hard for us to understand how he could do something, and that fits with whether it's his holiness or his justice, whether that fits with our condition when it's Jesus dying for us because we don't deserve that. Lots of different reasons we might not understand, but God does say hard things, and that's really what Habakkuk is wrestling with. And so God is going to raise up the Chaldeans, and he describes them as a bitter and hasty nation. Kind of just thinking like, this is God's choice. You know, out of everyone God could have used, out of all different ways God could exercise judgment, this is how he chooses to do it, to use the Chaldeans. I can kind of imagine, similar to what Alan was saying, I can imagine kind of thinking about Abraham and Sarah. Sarah's disbelief when God tells her she's going to conceive. I can kind of imagine Habakkuk thinking along the same lines of, there's no way that this is what God's answer is. There's no way that this is the way that God is going to do things. And it's just further illustrating that there's things that God does, or there's ways that God does things that we don't understand.
God answers this question, how long will you not do anything? And in verse 5, he says, I'm doing something in your days. I'm going to do something quickly. And then he says, you won't believe it if I told you. And of course, God is proven right as the conversation continues.
Absolutely right. Yeah, he's doing this in their days. And that actually might be one of the things that, so for people in this time, for Jews living in Judah at this time, they can look back and they can see all the things that God has done with their nation. And I guess for us too, we can look back through the scriptures and see what God has done, the works that he's done through whatever nations, whether it's Israel, Babylon, Assyria. There's so much that God has done, and it's easier for us to see what God's done in the past. But what God's doing right now is hard for us to see.
Let me just add this quickly. I think we struggle when judgment does not come in our days. Right? We see powerful people, whether politicians or business people or whatever, but folks who have all the money and all the ability and the power, they do things that are just horribly corrupt. And we look at that and we say, man, I just wish, wish justice would come down in my days. I want to see this now.
Right.
It may be difficult for us to wait for the delayed judgment.
Yeah, that God's timing, trust in God's timing. And I guess that would be another big theme in Habakkuk. It's not just trusting God to do what he's promised, to do things fitting with his character, but to also do that in his own timing, or really understanding why he's not doing something now, or why he's waiting, or why it's taking so long. Those are big questions that Habakkuk is asking. And so, Habakkuk's kind of saying, like, no, really, God, like, what are you going to do about this? I mean, you can't be serious about using the Chaldeans, right? And God says, no, that's what I'm going to do. I'm going to use the Chaldeans. And again, you can just imagine Habakkuk saying, what? Are you kidding me? Like, them? Out of everybody you could use, you have to use them? A similar comparison that I heard a lesson from someone down in Florida. He compared it to God sending in Hell's Angels to some city like Greenville to clean it up, to purge the wickedness out. Like, they're just as bad themselves. That's something that would be hard for us to understand. It's kind of a good comparison to make. That Jews here, they could see God working in their own nation. They could see God do things through them, through his people, through Israel. But for God to use a different nation was just, I think, would be hard for them to understand. It would be preposterous. For God to use a nation like this, so bitter and hasty as it describes the Chaldeans, which would be like bitter as they're fierce and they're cruel. They have a reputation for the way that they treat people they conquer. They make impetuous decisions and they move very quickly and conquer people and slight innocent people. They have a reputation, even God describes them as dreaded and fearsome in verse 7. And that their justice and dignity go forth from themselves. That they're really just governed by their own rule, their own say, their own rule of might. And even uses some animals to describe their viciousness and fierceness. And specifically notice verse 9. What are they coming for? God might be using the Chaldeans for his own purposes, but what are the Chaldeans coming for?
Violence and captives.
Violence. That is the one thing on their mind. And the second line there, all their faces forward. What's that mean? They are thinking of nothing else. It's not like Lot's wife where they turn around and look back. They are completely, solely focused on violence, destruction. That's all they care about. And that is what they're coming to do, destroy. In the next kind of couple verses, when he describes they sweep up by like the wind and go on. It's like a tornado coming in. They just destroy everything and it's all gone. That's the kind of people that God is using to judge Judah. So we can imagine why Habakkuk is confused by that. Why it doesn't make sense to him. He doesn't understand how God could use those kinds of people. So what is Habakkuk's second dilemma? Can someone read chapter 1, verses 12 through 17?
I'll read that. Are you not from everlasting, O Lord my God, my Holy One? We shall not die. O Lord, you have appointed them for judgment. O Roth, you have marked them for correction. You are pure eyes than to behold evil, and cannot look on wickedness. Why do you look on those who deal treacherously, and hold your tongue when the wicked devours a person more righteous than he? Why do you make men like fish of the sea, like creeping things that have no ruler over them? They take up all of them with a hook, and they catch them in their net, and they gather them in their drag net. Therefore they rejoice and are glad. Therefore they sacrifice to their net and burn incense to their dragnet. Because of them their share is sumptuous, and their food is plentiful. Shall they therefore empty their net and continue to slay nations without pity?
Thank you. So, just briefly, what is the second dilemma that Habakkuk has? What's his second problem? You kind of already said it, but just
Those people are more evil than we are. How
Right.
can you do this?
how can you use Babylon? So basically just Babylon with a question mark. Like them out of everyone, like we've been saying, how can you use Babylon? And I like how you pointed that out, Ben. A nation more wicked than we are. Or specifically how it says that the wicked swallows up the man more righteous than he. So, first of all, in these verses that we just read, he acknowledges two characteristics of God. What are they?
That he can't look on wickedness, that he's describes us as having too pure of eyes to behold evil, basically.
Yep. What else?
That he's eternal.
He's eternal. So eternal, and then basically the other way of describing what Joe was saying is holy. So he's everlasting and holy. Why would Habakkuk emphasize these qualities? Like that brief characterization of God he's giving, what is this emphasizing about God?
I think it's interesting that right after that, he says, he's saying, are you not these things? And then he's talking about him sending this punishment to them. And basically, what is going to happen to us? Like, are we going to die? He says, we will not die. I think it's kind of almost a question, like, how are you going to do this?
Right.
I know you are everlasting and eternal and holy, and why would you send this punishment that has the potential of ending us?
Right. And you're picking up on that this is kind of almost a rhetorical question, kind of not sure exactly. Go ahead, Ben.
It sounds almost like he's saying, you could have done anything you wanted, anything at all, and you're going with the Babylonians, of all people.
Yes. So when he says, are you not from everlasting, O Lord my God, my Holy One? And then he says, we shall not die. You can kind of see his faith and his doubt kind of in conflict. Again, this is like a battle of faith that Habakkuk is fighting, trying to understand how these things go together, how God can be holy and be righteous and be just and use someone like the Chaldeans. And so it emphasizes his confidence in God when he says, we shall not die, even though you can still see kind of the doubt in that. But he knows that God cannot and will not do wrong, and that he won't deny himself, he won't deny his covenant that he's made with his people. So he comes to the inevitable conclusion that, O Lord, you have ordained them as a judgment, and you, O Rock, have established them for reproof. So he recognizes that the only real explanation is that God is using them to judge Judah's wickedness. He understands that that's really the only way. It's not like God is condoning what the Chaldeans are doing. And so he's starting to understand what God has explained to him. And the way that he describes the Chaldeans is interesting. Of course, he says how these wicked are swallowing up the man more righteous than he. And that's something that we as humans do a lot. We compare ourselves to other people. Like, we're more righteous than them. We don't deserve this. Right? We don't deserve this judgment, this punishment that you're pronouncing upon us, because we're more righteous than them. I think it would be better to say they're more wicked than us, maybe, because it's not like Judah's righteous. They're both wicked. Maybe Chaldeans are more wicked, but they're both wicked. They both deserve punishment. And that's essentially God's answer. Can someone read, actually I'll read verse 1 of chapter 2, and then I'll get somebody to read verses 2 through 5 in just a second. So he says, I will take my stand at my watchpost and station myself on my tower. and look out to see what he will say to me and what I will answer concerning my complaint. So Habakkuk says, you know what? I'm just going to wait. And I think this needs to be our response as well when we're dealing with difficult things that we don't understand what God is doing. We don't understand what he's saying. We need to wait for an answer from him. Now, of course, this is a little different. I mean, God, he is talking directly with God, and God is answering him in a way that's a little different than we would be answered today. But he's saying, I'm going to wait. And so we always want to know when God will do something. We always want to know when God will answer us. But he's going to answer us in his time. And Habakkuk starts to realize that. So can someone read chapter 2, verses 2 through 5? Go ahead.
Then the Lord answered me and said, record the vision and inscribe it on tablets, that the one who reads it may run. For the vision is yet the appointed time. It hastens toward the goal, and it will not fail. Though it tarries, wait for it. For it will certainly come. It will not delay. Behold, as for the proud one, his soul is not right within him, but the righteous will live by his faith. Furthermore, wine betrays the haughty man, so that he does not stay at home. He enlarges his appetite like Sheol, and he is like death, never satisfied. He also gathers to himself all nations and collects to himself all people.
Okay. So this is God's starting to answer what Habakkuk's second complaint, second dilemma is. And what essentially is his response? You can especially see it in verse 4 and then 5. But what is God's response?
I think God is, starting in verse 4, is kind of setting the stage for what's going to come later in the chapter, to where he's acknowledging, yes, these are a proud people, and let me describe to you what will become of this nation that's proud.
Yeah. So basically, God is saying, if I can write, this is hard. I will judge them too. So it's not just Judah that he's judging. He's going to judge the Chaldeans as well. In verse 4, he talks about, he's talking about Babylon, Chaldea. His soul is puffed up. It is not upright within him. And contrast that with essentially what Habakkuk is learning about how God's people should be. That the righteous shall live by faith. And furthermore in verse 5, moreover wine is a traitor, an arrogant man who is never at rest. His greed is as wide as Sheol. Like death, he is never enough. He gathers for himself all nations and collects as his own all peoples. So God is going to judge them for their pride, their greed, and their lust. But that contrast is the righteous shall live by faith. Can I get 3 people to read just a few quick passages? Yeah, go ahead.
That's like reading Proverbs. I mean, he's basically imparting Proverbs to Habakkuk.
Yeah.
Wisdom.
Right. Yeah. So this verse specifically, chapter 2, verse 4, the righteous shall live by his faith. Can I get someone to turn to Romans 1, someone to turn to Galatians 3, and someone to Hebrews 10. That's Romans 1, Galatians 3, and Hebrews 10. There's 3 specific passages where these are mentioned in the New Testament. We'll just read through them quickly. I got somebody in Romans 1. Yeah, so can you read verses 16 through 18?
For I am not ashamed of the gospel, for it is the power of God for salvation to everyone who believes, to the Jew first and also to the Greek. For in it the righteousness of God is revealed from faith to faith, as it is written, but the righteous man shall live by faith. For the wrath of God is revealed from heaven against all ungodliness and unrighteousness of men who suppress the truth in unrighteousness.
Okay. So he quotes this verse from Habakkuk 2, verse 4. The righteous shall live by faith. What is Paul emphasizing in Romans? Of that passage, the righteous shall live by his faith, what part of that is Paul emphasizing in Romans?
Righteous.
Right. So he's emphasizing the righteous shall live by his faith. Who's got Galatians chapter 3? Can you read verses 10 through 12?
For as many as are the works of the law are under a curse. For it is written, cursed is everyone who does not abide by all things written in the book of the law to perform them. Now that no one is justified by the law before God is evident, for the righteous man shall live by faith. However, the law is not of faith. On the contrary, he who practices them shall live by them.
So what does he emphasize from the righteous shall live by his faith? What does Paul emphasize in Galatians?
Faith?
Close. It's the living part. So I mean, he emphasizes all three. I mean, he's quoting the passage, but what we're seeing is in Romans he kind of emphasizes the righteous. Galatians, the righteous shall live by their faith, and then what would you guess that Hebrews is going to be talking about? By his faith. So can someone read Hebrews 10 verses 32 through 39?
I've got that. 32 through 39?
Yep.
But recall the former days in which, after you were eliminated, you endured a great struggle with sufferings, partly while you were made a spectacle both by reproaches and tribulations, and partly while you became companions of those who were so treated. For you had compassion on me in my chains, and joyfully accepted the plundering of your goods, knowing that you have a better and an enduring possession for yourselves in heaven. Therefore do not cast away your confidence, which has a great reward. For you have a need of endurance, so that after you have done the will of God, that you may receive the promise. For yet in a little while, and yet he who is coming will come and will not tarry. Now that the just shall live by faith, but if anyone draws back, my soul has no pleasure in him. We are not of those who draw back to perdition, but of those who believe to the saving of the soul.
So those three passages are where Habakkuk 2:4 is quoted in the New Testament. And we'll talk more about those in several weeks when we go through our theme study of Habakkuk and the themes that he talks about. But I just wanted to bring those up to kind of have those in your mind, that this passage, this kind of idea that Habakkuk is talking about the righteous living by his faith, and this kind of being the answer to the hard things, the hard questions that we have, the times where we don't understand what God is doing, we don't understand when he's going to do something, that this is kind of the answer to that, about the righteous shall live by his faith. And we're going to see that Habakkuk understands this more and more through the last chapter and a half as well, and he starts to kind of show that himself. We've got 5 more minutes? All right. So chapter 2, basically verses 6 through 20 are what's described from several different commentaries. Like they all kind of say it's the taunt song of God. So God is pronouncing these woes on Babylon. And so it comes down to 5 main things. In verses 6 through 8, it's the plunderer and extortioner. So plunderer and extortioner, that is a description of Babylon, of Chaldea. There we go. That's a description of them, and that they plunder the vanquished nations and they force others to pay tribute. The next one would be they build an empire by unjust gain. So these are things descriptions of Babylon and Chaldea that God is saying, you're going to be judged for these things specifically. They build a city with bloodshed. I'm kind of going over these quickly because it's pretty straightforward what we're saying, and I would like to get through chapter 3 still. So verses 15 through 17 is about the violent and those who degrade others. And in the last couple verses in chapter 2, verses 18 through 20 is those who trust in false gods. So for all these things, God is going to judge the Chaldeans. All right? And that is, again, that's part of his answer to Habakkuk. That how can you use Babylon? Well, I'm going to judge them too for all of these things that they're doing. Now, we get to chapter 3, and I'm going to read through it real quick so we can try to get through this. A prayer of Habakkuk the prophet, according to Shigionoth. O Lord, I have heard the report of you, and your work, O Lord, do I fear. In the midst of the years, revive it. In the midst of the years, make it known. In wrath, remember mercy. God came from Teman, and the Holy One from Mount Paran. His splendor covered the heavens, and the earth was full of his praise. His brightness was like the light. Rays flashed from his hand, and there he veiled his power. Before him went pestilence, and plague followed at his heels. He stood and measured the earth. He looked and shook the nations. Then the eternal mountains were scattered. The everlasting hills sank low. His were the everlasting ways. I saw the tents of Cushan in affliction. The curtains of the land of Midian did tremble. Was your wrath against the rivers, O Lord? Was your anger against the rivers, or your indignation against the sea? When you rode on your horses, on your chariot of salvation, you stripped the sheath from your bow, calling for many arrows. You split the earth with rivers. The mountains saw you and writhed. The raging waters swept on. The deep gave forth its voice. It lifted its hands on high. The sun and moon stood still in their place. At the light of your arrows as they sped, at the flashing of your glittering spear, you marched through the earth in fury. You threshed the nations in anger. You went out for the salvation of your people, for the salvation of your anointed. You crushed the head of the house of the wicked, laying him bare from thigh to neck. You pierced with his own arrows the heads of his warriors. You came like a whirlwind to scatter me, rejoicing as if to devour the poor in secret. You trampled the sea with your horses, the surging of mighty waters. I hear, and my body trembles. My lips quiver at the sound. Rottenness enters into my bones. My legs tremble beneath me, yet I will quietly wait for the day of the Lord, or for the day of trouble, to come upon people who invade us. Though the fig tree does not blossom, nor fruit be on the vines, the produce of the olive fail, and the fields yield no food, the flock be cut off from the fold, and there be no herd in the stalls, yet I will rejoice in the Lord. I will take joy in the God of my salvation. God, the Lord, is my strength. He makes my feet like the deer's. He makes me tread on my high places. To the choir master with stringed instruments. Okay, so chapter 3 is this hymn, this prayer of Habakkuk. And it encapsulates everything we've talked about so far, of the dilemmas that Habakkuk has had, and the answers that God gives, where finally Habakkuk realizes that he needs to trust in God. And that's essentially the conclusion he comes to, that the righteous shall live by his faith. Specifically, if you look at these last couple verses, 17, 18, and 19. Though the fig tree should not blossom, nor fruit be on the vines, the birds of the olive fail, and the fields yield no food, the flock be cut off from the fold, there be no herd in the stalls, all of their animals, all of the ways they have to produce food and their livelihood, if all of that is gone, which is what would happen in captivity, they will cut all of that off, they'll run out. That's exactly what's going to happen. Even if all of that happens, I will rejoice in the Lord. I will take joy in the God of my salvation. God, the Lord, is my strength. That is the conclusion that Habakkuk comes to. He finally realizes that we don't always have the answers, but I'm going to trust in God. Wish we had more time. We'll talk more about it in a couple weeks, but